All righty, so we're recording. All right, so we're glad to have Shemia Fagan, who's running for Senator Shemia Fagan, who's running for Secretary of State for the great state of Oregon. And so we're glad to have you here as part of HD44's conversation series, trying to get information out to voters as they're filling out their ballots. And so I guess I'm going to just go ahead and start right off the bat, start asking a question. So for people, there's a lot of people, especially in HD44, who are new to Oregon, and many people who, even if they've lived here for years, their whole life, they may not be exactly familiar with the position of Secretary of State. So maybe if you could just take a few minutes to explain the job of Secretary of State to someone who would have no outside knowledge about it at all.
Good. That's what I've been doing a lot of in the past 6 months. So first off, Alex, nice to meet you and happy to see my HD44 friends. And, I'll just back up quickly just because it's completely understandable if folks don't understand what this job is. Not everybody, grew up. My kids now know what this job is because they're growing up with a politically connected parent, but that's not how I grew up. I actually grew up in small towns in Wasco County, in little towns, the Dalles and Duffer. And my dad was a single parent raising 3 kids by himself. Our mom struggled with drug addiction, mostly meth and heroin, and was homeless for most of my life. And so my dad raised us by himself. And the summer before I started 2nd grade, my dad took us on a camping trip. It was a couple weeks in the woods. I remember catching crawdads and campfires and sleeping in a big family tent. And it wasn't until many years later that my brother told me what had really happened, that we had been evicted from our house in the Dalles and we had nowhere to go, and that our dad didn't want us to realize that we were homeless. And so he took us on a camping trip while he tried to find a place for us to live. And so that's why, as both a civil rights attorney and an Oregon lawmaker, I've spent my career really fighting for other families that are hanging on by a thread. And that's why, I've been proud to champion things like paid sick leave and raising the minimum wage, and housing stability all throughout Oregon and funding our schools. But I've also been at the forefront of every major expansion of voting rights during my time in the legislature, from automatic voter registration to national popular vote, and most recently with prepaid postage. But as you were mentioning, Alex, most people don't realize, in fact, when I first announced my campaign for Secretary of State, I quickly learned that almost everybody has no idea what the hell this job is. In fact,
Yes.
I have an older brother who is a welder out in Umatilla County, and I told him, like, oh my gosh, I'm running for Secretary of State. And he was like, awesome, so you'll get other people's coffee? Like, that was his guess. And so I always like to start there with a basic level, which is that first, I believe this job at its core, it's about making sure government works for everybody, from running elections that are fair and secure, auditing state programs and revenues to make sure they're making a real difference in the lives of people who need them most, conducting our public records in a way that holds our leaders accountable, and this year, very likely, conducting legislative redistricting. And I have pledged to do that using a nonpartisan People's Commission, but one that is rooted in racial equity and historically underrepresented communities.
Absolutely. That's excellent. And we know that one of the issues you mentioned, redistricting and gerrymandering, is obviously something that is a big issue nationally. It's just now within the last 5 or 10 years become a big issue. I guess that sort of leads me into our second question is, this is a big race, and as I stated before, with a lot of people not exactly knowing the particulars of what a Secretary of State does, what do you think is so critical about your specific election and the differences between yourself and your opponent?
Oh, so many differences. I mean, my opponent is actually, a Trump supporter. She was a Trump delegate in 2016 to the convention and has really parroted his lies about vote by mail, has parroted his lies about American history. In fact, just today, she was out there talking about condemning the 1619 project that was won a Pulitzer Prize that the New York Times did, saying the exact same things about the 1619 project that President Trump says, that it's unrepresentative of American history. Well, it's probably unrepresentative of white people's American history, in terms of folks that want to ignore our, the racial inequities and when our country was founded. And so we're very, very different. But I think on a few key issues. Number one, I have been an unabashed supporter of vote by mail, seeking to expand it at every turn. But more importantly, I actually don't think that should be a partisan issue. I don't think expanding vote by mail or supporting vote by mail should be about Democrats or progressives or liberals. It should be about everybody who believes in our democracy. And sadly, my colleague Senator Thatcher voted against every major expansion of voting rights that I voted for. And that's here in Oregon. Across the country, we did see, before President Trump got involved, we saw Republican governors, Republican legislatures actually supporting automatic voter registration. So it was really just with Senator Thatcher and the Republicans here in Oregon that was a partisan issue. I don't think voting rights should be partisan. I think that everybody that's eligible should have the easiest access to a ballot and getting that ballot in as possible. And then it's on us to actually convince folks that we share their values and to inspire folks to want to vote for us. And so that's a big one. And then you mentioned redistricting, Alex, which I think is really, really key. As I mentioned, I have pledged to do that with a People's Commission that is rooted in racial equity, making sure that the folks who are on that commission actually look like the great state of Oregon. And Senator Thatcher, my concern is that if we had her doing redistricting, that she would very likely, Oregon could end up looking like Wisconsin in terms of political gerrymandering, which folks just need to Google that to find out how atrocious the political gerrymandering is there.
Right, and we see exactly with, you mentioned Wisconsin, people waiting in line in the middle of a pandemic, an unprecedented pandemic, just to be able to exercise their civic duty. And I think that people need to understand that, in Oregon, we're very fortunate because I'm from Kansas. And I remember standing in line for hours just to caucus. And I can't imagine having to do that when you have to have your mask on and you have to remain socially distanced. And especially now, that was in a primary versus now we're talking about general election where everyone's really hyped to be involved in it. I guess my next question for you is, and you alluded to it earlier, but what keeps you inspired to stay in public service? You mentioned about your family, but what do you think keeps you inspired, and why do you think it's so important that particularly young people and people that may not be as engaged stay engaged in the political process?
That's really what drew me to political service in the first place was, I thought it was something I might do someday when I was in my 50s or 60s or 70s. But I think it's really important that we have young people, and I'm young for the business I'm in. I'm not young for everybody, but I'm 39. I've got 2 young kids, and just sitting in a caucus room, I think it's also important that we have seniors serving, because I think it's important that we have folks all across the political spectrum, or the age spectrum and political spectrum, but age spectrum, who are actually experiencing what it's like to be 60 and 70 today, but also what it's like to be a mom of young kids today, and to be living in a world with, Zoom on school for my second grader. And so what keeps me engaged is, boy, we fight hard sometimes and we struggle to make a real difference. And we don't always go as far as some of us would like to go in terms of making real change. But the change that we have made makes a real difference for people. And I'll tell you one quick story. Right after we passed paid sick leave, for everybody in Oregon that has over 10 employers, everybody has protected sick leave. But folks who have worked for employers with 10 employers or more have paid sick leave across the country or across the state. And I remember being in Target, this was a couple of years ago, and there was a older woman checking me out, and we were talking about it, and she was coughing a little bit. And I was so excited, we just passed paid sick leave, and I was like, oh, do you know that your employer has to give you paid sick leave? And she almost like broke down crying, like her eyes turned up, and she's like, really? And I said, yeah, they can't, like, you get to just tell them that you're sick, and then you not only are you protected, but you actually can take care of you or a family member or a grandchild. And she was like, oh my gosh. So she turned out she lives with her daughter, and her daughter has a child and a grandchild, and she's like, oh, I'm sick, but also my grandchild is sick, but I didn't want to leave work. And so just seeing that, like, what, that relief on her face that she doesn't have to choose between a paycheck and taking care of herself and her grandchild when she was sick. It's just, that inspiration that you get to make an individual difference in people's lives on such a mass scale. And, we had lots of those stories after we passed the ban on no cause evictions, where we had folks that were like, oh man, my landlord just tried to evict everybody in our whole, apartment, but your law had gone into effect. And so I just think there's some, getting to see the real difference that it makes for people is what keeps me grounded. Because I remember thinking, I wish that folks had done some things differently when I was growing up. As I mentioned, my mom battled addiction. We could have a better healthcare system that treats addiction as a public health crisis and not like a criminal matter. And so I think that it's important that I stay grounded by connected to real folks in my life. And then I continue to work towards making a difference and see that light in their eyes for folks that are, struggling to make ends meet.
Absolutely. And when you talk about your background, I mean, I know I come from a background in which, you mentioned about being housing insecure. I haven't necessarily had that concern, but I've had similar concerns as far as a budget being limited. And I think one thing about it is when you see people that are really involved in this work is people that that are not in usually come from privilege, usually
Right.
understand how much is at stake as far as elections and how important government is, having a certain social safety net and contract. Do you think that that's something that you think that's something that definitely has driven you, that I don't know if maybe you've come up with exactly the same thesis that I came up with. Do you think that that's something that was going through your head as far as that?
There's nothing I could add to what you said, Alex. You articulated that perfectly.
Absolutely. It matters who sits on your city council, and especially with the state and whatnot. You all may not get the biggest media attention, but Oregon's really leading as far as progressive politics and progressive policies. And I think that it's definitely due to people like you and the work that you've done over the last several years that we can benefit from that. And this is my last question. So we've talked a lot about voting. We've talked a lot about different work that you've done as far as voting. Nationally, we're talking a lot about voting and voting by mail for many people, especially in places like where I'm from in Kansas. This is going to be their very first time voting by mail. How has voting by mail been successful for Oregonians? And why do you think that we're getting so much flack as far as voting by mail? Why do you think voting by mail has become such a controversy?
Well, I'll start with the last part of your question first, which it's really clear the president's own deputy campaign manager said, if all these people vote and they vote by mail and they vote easily, then the president's not going to win. So it's purely politically motivated that he has raised an issue with vote by mail. I mean, we've been doing it for over 20 years in Oregon. I've actually never voted any other way. The thought of people standing in lines, and I've never literally seen a polling place. Like I don't even, I've seen like the cartoon civics books that I have for my kids or the news when they show, but like I've never actually seen a polling place. I've always turned my ballot in either by mail or a drop box. And so the fact is the president and sadly his allies are out there saying if more people vote, we lose, instead of saying, oh, if more people vote, then we have a government that's more representative of the views and the needs of more people. Therefore, we should actually be trying to fill those needs and to learn from people's experience and then maybe say, oh, I was mistaken on this view. I now believe this because I've learned from people and I practiced empathetic listening. And so that's why we've had flack over it, because it's certainly not because of any problems with it. In fact, I've been the only candidate between Senator Thatcher and myself willing to state just unequivocally that claims of widespread voter fraud are a myth.
Mhm.
And they're a myth created and spread by people who just want to use that myth to make it harder for certain people to vote. And I don't quote conservative think tanks very often. I'm sure folks at HD44 at least know that much about me. But the Conservative Heritage Foundation actually reviewed Oregon's vote by mail over the 20-year history. They looked at over 15 million ballots and they found 14 instances of voter fraud. It's literally less than 1 in a million. And so, the bottom line is there's a lot of things in our everyday lives that we trust and that we do and will continue to do that are safer than vote by mail, like drinking coffee, because about 5% of your coffee beans might have mold in them. The FDA says that's safe. It's okay. It's going to taste fine. Eating chocolate, about 1% of your cocoa beans get to have some insect bug parts, but the FDA says that's fine. It won't hurt you. I'm going to keep eating my frozen M&Ms out of the fridge. And so, vote by mail is safe. It's incredibly safe. And folks just need to push back on those lies with 4 key things. Number one, we have a paper trail for every ballot. So easily audit it to show that people who voted for this person, that was the vote that was cast. We have forensic signature verification so that whoever's signing that envelope is the person who's registered to vote. We have a unique barcode tracking so that when you turn in your ballot, Alex, it's recorded as Alex ballot has been received. So you couldn't vote a second time or nobody could vote for you because that unique barcode is unique to you as a registered voter. And then number 4, none of our counting machines are connected to the internet. so we don't have to worry about somebody coming and hacking our counting machines. And those 4 keys have kept Oregon's vote by mail safe for over 20 years, and it will continue to stay safe if I'm Secretary of State.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we want to thank you so much for your time. This has been an excellent interview. And personally, just on a personal note, I hope you win. You definitely sealed my support for you. I was there before, but this is honestly, it is great to have a very casual conversation with someone. And like you did exactly what I was hoping. You explained the position. And I definitely think that you'd be an excellent Secretary of State. So I want to thank you for that. All
Thanks for
right.
casual in our hoodies, right?
Absolutely. And we got our hoodies on too. So we're styling. One of the things we're going to have to work on in a few years is trying to make sure that you can wear these on the floor of the legislature. You can wear these on the floor instead of the suits.
There you go.
But that's
You join the legislature, then we'll make that happen.
We'll see. If anyone votes for me, then that means there was no one else qualified around. So we'll see.
No, that's not true at all. That's not true at all. Let's get you there.
Well, thank you so much for this.
You got it, Alex. Thanks a lot.
All righty.
Don't forget.